Ralph Reed's founder and chairman of the Faith and Freedom Coalition. Ralph, thank you for coming on. Let's say
you bet, Chris. Good to be with you again.
Thank you. I'm just setting it up with what looks to be the direction of the court, perhaps a narrow decision, perhaps just dealing with California, but perhaps positively for the pro-choice or the pro-same-sex marriage community. How will the people on the conservative side of things, how will you react to that? What would be your plan?
Well, if that were to happen, and of course, this is not my first rodeo. I know it's not yours. I don't tend to put a lot of lay down a lot of bets on oral arguments. You know, it's very hard to interpret how the court's going to rule based on the repartee in oral arguments. But if they were to do that, Chris, I think it would be profoundly disappointing. The people of California voted not once but twice that they wanted marriage defined between a man and a woman. I think this kind of issue, as we saw with the very polarizing and highly divisive issue of Roe v. Wade, is best left to the people and their elected representatives. It's best left to the Congress and the various legislatures. If the people of California want to change their constitution, they can do it at the ballot box. I don't think the Supreme Court should intervene. But if it were to happen, it would not have any effect in any of the other states. And let's be clear, 86% of the American people live in states today that define marriage as between a man and a woman. This is the majority position for the American people.
Well, what you really do understand as well as I do is the way that there's repercussions. The old story was the Supreme Court follows the election results. Well, the election results often follow the Supreme Court. People react. You know, most voters vote negatively. That's how they vote. They don't like things, so they get out there and vote against them. Do you think there'll be well, you would be leading it, perhaps, an effort to try to rectify what you see as a wrong decision?
Well, I think as you pointed out in the earlier segment, Chris, it's not so much that I want to do it, but the reality is when the Supreme Court gets over its skis and when it tries to be the one that is the progenitor of very significant social change, rather than allow it to take place incrementally and gradually with back and forth, maybe with different answers in different states and different communities. I think the problem is whether it was the backlash against Engel versus Vitale, the school prayer case that you mentioned earlier, whether, you know, there was a very interesting cover story on Time Magazine's cover a few weeks ago that pointed out that the Roe v. Wade actually hurt the pro-choice cause because it's led to this very strong pro-life movement that is restricting abortion on demand in the various legislatures. So I think it would be a big mistake.
May have you in a different, from a very different angle politically. I think she agrees with you about her problems. But look, you're not going to come out against all landmark decisions. You wouldn't say, for example, we didn't need the separate but equal decision in the Brown case back in '54. I mean, that was these states were way behind with this separate but equal attitude. Didn't that have to happen by the Supreme Court? Don't we need leadership from the top on occasion?
We do, but let's remember that Brown v. Board was not leading. It was following by 90 years the 14th Amendment to the Constitution that said that African Americans couldn't be denied equal protection under the law. As you know, there was virtually no enforcement of that by the Department of Justice after that, so the court had to step in. But even with that court opinion, as it is rightfully honored by all Americans today, the fact is, Chris, that the real progress on breaking down Jim Crow and creating more equality for men and women of all color was the Civil Rights Act of '64, Voting Rights Act of '65, and the Fair Housing Act of '68. The reality where the rubber met the road was in passing legislation in legislative chambers and getting them signed by the president.
It's interesting you argue this, and I think you make a good point, although we may disagree on a lot of these issues. I think we do. I do think it's always better when the public will coincides with the rights. But sometimes the public will is a little slow. But I agree with you on those cases. I think it's the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were powerful because they had the power behind them of both political parties, of Everett Dirksen and Lyndon Johnson, and a heavy support by the Republican Party, by the way, at the time. They were amazingly influential. But I also think sometimes the Supreme Court has to get ahead, and has to get ahead early, as it did with these early cases. But anyway, thank you, Ralph Reed, for coming on.
Thank you very much, Chris. Good to be with you.